So it's great that you were able to kind of carve out, your own niche within business valuation. But for those who don't know, what is business valuation?
So business valuation is figuring out the value of a business, or in sort of a parallel line of work, intangible assets or intellectual property. So most of us are familiar with real estate appraisers. I do the same thing as a real estate appraiser, but I do it for businesses and intangible assets.
Right. So when would a business owner or an executive team need a business valuation?
So we could take up the entire podcast with a list of this thing, but we're not going to do that because that's not fair to the internet. Four general reasons why. One is there's a transaction. You're going to buy a business, sell your business. You'd never sell your house without getting it appraised. You wouldn't buy one. Same thing with a business. And that's where I do a lot of my work. Also, when somebody's going to raise money for their business or invest in a business valuation comes into play there too. And we help clients with that. There's another group of valuation needs that I do some of, not as much, in compliance. There are certain tax events that require a valuation. Usually the transfer of an estate or gifting a business to another generation, something like that. That requires a valuation under US law. There are certain accounting requirements for valuation. You might have heard of fair value accounting. It's people like me that make that go. We tell the accountants what number they should put on their balance sheet of the income statement, depending on the assignment. And then the final grouping is dispute resolution, which I don't do personally. My dad did and was like I said, was excellent at it. And what that means in English is that in a civil case where you're fighting over the value of shares or business damages, something like that, the lawyer's job is to argue to the court who broke the law. And the expert's job, somebody like me, has a job of telling the court what the number ought to be. Mm-hmm. So transactions, taxes, accounting, litigation, disputes. Those are generally the four kind of categories of reasons that somebody would reach out to somebody like me for help.
Great. So I find that many entrepreneurs and executives have different ideas about how to value a business. From your perspective, what are some of the best ways to estimate the value of a business?
Yeah, so it's funny. One thing I say about our profession is we're a genius if our value conclusion is roughly what the client thought it was going to be, and we're a moron if it's materially different. And that's just the nature of the profession we've chosen. But to my mind, there is no best methodology. The best methodology is the one that's best supported by the data. And in some cases, there are businesses where, take restaurants, for example, there are tons of restaurant transactions all over the place. It's very easy to determine the value of a restaurant because you can find comparable restaurants all over the place. On the other hand, take a startup data analytics company with no track record, right? That it may be difficult to find comparable companies. And therefore you have to rely on something that's more aligned with cash flow, or you can't rely on purchases of companies, but you have to rely on data involving venture capital investments in those kinds of companies, because that's how the market works. Or maybe there's a company that's failing and you wouldn't use either of those two, but rather you'd kind of figure out, well, what's the value of its assets? If you're just going to sell it off piecemeal, we call that liquidation value. So there is no one single methodology, at least in my mind. What I tell people is I go where the data takes me, and wherever I find the data is the most reliable, abundant, credible, that's where I'm going to go. And if I'm really lucky, there's enough data where it enables me to use multiple methodologies. And the hope is that they all kind of more or less point in the same direction. That's what gives me the opportunity to do my happy dance.